Hey there, folding fans. I'm James Peak at Foldspace Origami Studio, and in this video, we're going to talk about cutting paper. Specifically, I'm going to show you a few methods that I like to use when I want to take a sheet of standard size origami paper, and in this case, again, this is 15 centimeters or about 6 inches square, and we are going to want to cut the paper into fourths or quarter the paper. And there are a few reasons why we might want to do this. One example is, so I set out to make a Basheta star. This is a very popular, well-known Kusudama model, one of my favorites. Really fun to fold, great assembly. I highly recommend it. But anyhow, this model requires 30 pieces of paper. Okay, so I have all of this beautiful craft paper that I bought from the source, the Origami USA store, and it's gold on one side, has either black or in this case red on the other side, and I wasn't willing to use up 30 sheets of this paper because it's so nice. But the other reason that I wanted to quarter the paper was that I wanted the end result to be a little bit smaller. If you use the full size, the modular ends up being a little bit larger, and maybe that's what you're going for. But in this case, I wanted something a bit smaller. So I took a bunch of sheets and cut them into fourths, and it ends up being a really great size unit for this particular model. And another example, most recently, I've been making these flowers that were designed by Miyuki Kawamura. This is a family of designs that she invented called Petite Bouquet. And there's lots of variations. It's a really clever design. All the units start out as water bomb bases and very straightforward. But anyhow, I was making flowers, so I wanted to use duo colored paper because each of these models has a color change, right? And I didn't want to use just plain kami because the white side of the kami is just it's kind of boring. But I have this pack of duo sheets that I just recently found on Amazon that has some really great color combinations. I'm always on the lookout for good duo color combinations. I feel like there's a lot of possibilities out there that have yet to be explored as far as doubling up different colors. But anyway, that's for another video. And of course, for this, they all have to be the same color combination. Well, they don't have to be, but it looks better when they're the same color combination, right? So most of these require at least 5 units. This one I think was 6. Yeah, 6 units. So anyway, again, it's a great opportunity to subdivide the paper into quarters. And once again, the whole scale issue comes up where I did make one of these once out of slightly larger paper, and the bigger the flower gets, the less it looks like a flower. It just doesn't look right. I feel like there's a range or particular sort of size that works well as a flower. So in this case, the 3-inch, or I should say 7.5 centimeter paper worked great. So now I'm going to show you a few different methods that I sometimes use for cutting the paper accurately and cleanly. Now, something I meant to mention before is that if you're lucky enough, you can find the right size paper for the types of models that I just showed you. And in fact, I got this at the source at the OUSA convention in New York City. I'll drop a link to this product down in the comments below, but that would sort of negate the whole point of this video, right? So now the first thing I want to say is that if you're new to cutting paper for origami, and if you didn't know this already, the last thing you want to do is use a pair of scissors. Scissors will not give you a straight cut. It's very difficult to do that. So forget the scissors. Now, a technique that a lot of people use is using a straight edge and an X-Acto blade, or in this case, it's a box cutter, right? Now, I used to use this method a lot. However, one thing that I found, one day I was cutting along the straight edge, and I noticed little metal shavings on the paper that were coming off from the ruler, and I thought, oh no, that's no good. Okay, so I stopped using this technique. Now I think a lot of folders out there still use this method, and there's probably ways that you can tweak that method that will prevent shaving your ruler off. But I'm going to show you something else. The tool that I like to use is a rotary cutter, and I use a acrylic straight edge. In this case, I use an Omni grid. Now there are, oh, hold on a second. Okay, there we go. That's better. So I use an Omni grid and a rotary cutter, and these are tools that quilters use for cutting fabric. And the Omni grid is really useful because it has a grid built into built into itself. And so, and for some reason, I think the rotary cutter, the way it runs along the edge of the straight edge, it doesn't shave off anything. So that's good. Because, I mean, you don't want to shave off the ruler because then it suddenly won't be straight anymore. But the next thing we have to talk about is where to cut. Okay, now the Omni grid does have this grid on it, but it's in inches, and our paper was cut in centimeters. Okay, and 15 centimeters is not exactly 6 inches, it's 5.9 inches. Okay, so we can't really use the markings on here for measuring, although we can still use it for alignment. So here's the thing that I typically do, is to find the middle of two different edges, I make pinch marks. Okay, now I'm not going to fold all the way through, because the thing is, if I were to fold the whole thing in half and then try to cut along that crease, chances are I'm not going to cut exactly on that crease. It's very difficult to do that. And then the end result is that the edge of your paper is slightly curled. Okay, so we don't want that. But what we can do is just make some pinch marks. So I'm using this gold and red paper, and it's going to be a little easier to see on the red side. So I'm going to make mountain fold pinches on two opposite sides. So if you bring those two corners together, and then make sure you're kind of pulling away from where you're holding the corners together in alignment. Give yourself a pinch mark on this side, and then I'll do the same down here. Give myself another pinch mark. Okay. All right. So we've got two marks, and then now we can use the Omni grid. And I must say that hopefully the squares that you're cutting from are already accurate. Now, if they're not perfectly cut square, then these aren't going to be perfectly cut, but we're always trying to do the best we can. But you know, and oftentimes you can find paper that's cut very accurately, and this paper is pretty close as far as I can tell. Now I'm going to kind of shine my light over here because you're going to want to be able to see your pinch marks really well. And so I'm going to line up the edge of the Omni grid along those pinch marks. Now, one thing else I can do, like I said, I can still use some of the lines of the Omni grid for the alignment, but really I'm just going to be looking for those pinch marks. And and I also find that the pinch mark, you don't necessarily want it right underneath the edge. Like, it might need to be like a hair to the side. You'll have to just kind of experiment to see what works well for you. But I'm going to get that lined up as best I can. And I'm going to hold this down very firmly. Of course, you don't want this to slide around. Now I'm going to get my rotary cutter. And I always keep it closed when I'm not using it. And then I engage the blade. Now when you cut, it's This can take some practice to get accurate because it's still possible to kind of veer off course a little bit. But if you just kind of push the blade up against the OmniGrid or whatever straight edge you're using, and just make sure that you're keeping it directly above where you're cutting. You want to keep it vertical, and you want to kind of keep pushing it against your guide all the way through. Now, when you're cutting bigger sheets, keep in mind that your body, your shoulder naturally kind of wants to arc. So this just takes some practice getting used to and finding out what works best. And before I move the grid, you can see there's just a little hair of paper kind of sticking out from underneath. Now, you can't actually see this in the camera, but I'll take my word for it. There's like a hair of paper, and that's why when you're lining up your pinch marks, you might want to go a little bit to one side of those pinch marks, but it's just going to take some trial and error in figuring it out. Okay, so we're halfway, well, I guess a third of the way there, because we still need to make 2 more cuts. But we just use the same technique where now we take these rectangles, line up the corners, and then I'm going to kind of pull away as I'm making my pinch mark on one end, and then do the same thing on the other end. I got my 2 pinch marks, and line this up, and making sure my pinch marks are just to the outside, just barely to the outside of my edge here. Okay. And I'm going to press down. Now, one thing I will say, unfortunately, the table that I'm using, it's a folding table. It's not perfectly flat. Ideally, you want to be using a surface that is completely flat. But I'm just doing the best I can here with what I've got. And I feel like that looks pretty good. Keep the blade vertical, kind of push it against your straight edge. And sometimes, as I'm getting closer to the top, I'll kind of move my finger over to secure the paper to keep it from moving too much. But here we go. So let's test these. Let's take a look. I'm going to put one in front of the other. And yeah, there's a little bit of color showing. So not perfect, but pretty close. So there's always going to be a little bit of human error. But we just want to try to get it as close as we can. Now, I'm going to go on and cut this other piece, but I want to say that there are actually other techniques that I use that I'm about to show you that are a bit different, where I'm going to use a completely different type of tool. No OmniGrid, no rotary cutter. By the way, I mean, just the OmniGrid, rotary cutter, these OmniGrids come in different sizes. You can get them in much bigger sizes. I use them a lot for cutting bigger sheets, and I basically kind of do the same thing where I create end points, I line it up with the straight edge, and then I use this. And you see how I just kind of move my finger over? I don't know if you can see it, but once I pass that point, I put my finger there to keep the paper steady, because it is going to want to kind of move on you as you get to the top. But let's see how that one turned out. Pretty close. There's a little bit of color showing, but good enough for jazz. Of course, we're doing origami. We're not playing jazz, so it's a little different. Okay, so that's my first method. Now let me show you my preferred method. Okay, so I realize that many of you might not have one of these types of paper cutters. I hear a lot of people refer to these as guillotine-style, although I don't feel like that's entirely accurate. Now, there are actual guillotine-type paper cutters. I saw one at the UPS store where it really is a blade that comes down like an actual guillotine, right? But this, of course, is on an arm, all right? if you're serious about cutting paper and doing origami, I highly recommend you invest in one of these. Now, just a quick aside, this particular paper cutter used to belong to my grandfather, James Ward Copening. And of course, I was named after him. I'm James Ward Peak. But he used to have a dark room in his basement, and he would use this. And in fact, it says Photo Materials Company, Chicago, Illinois. That's who it was manufactured by. But real quick, I just want to show you the underside of this. I'm not entirely sure, but it looks like he bought this for $7.75, and this is where the real uncertainty comes in. Perhaps it was in August of 1959. I don't know. I can only speculate, and he's no longer with us, so I can't ask him. But anyway, I inherited this from him, and it's amazing how sharp it is and how well it still cuts. So when you're using this type of paper cutter, more often than not, I would say never trust the accuracy of the grid on the paper cutter. Typically, they have a grid. Now, there are some brands that might be a little bit more accurate than others, but what I found is that when it comes to cutting perfect squares or rectangles for origami, just don't trust the grid. You're going to use a different method, okay? But we're going to use the same general idea that we used when we used the OmniGrid, where we're going to use pinch marks. And I put a pinch mark on each end. Now, what's kind of cool about this is that, so of course my pinch marks here are both mountain pinches. What I can do is actually kind of let the mountain pinches kind of wrap around the edge of the blade. And just the angle, the fold, helps it do that. So we end up getting really good alignment. And that's what we want, right? So I'm going to hold the paper steady. Now, of course, you've got to be super careful with these so that you don't cut yourself. But I am going to hold it pretty close to the blade. Now, I have a big one. I have a big cutter. It's 2 feet by 2 feet. And when I use that cutter, I actually always put a straight edge down next to where I'm cutting. And in fact, I'll just go ahead and do that here. I wouldn't normally get this big thing out for this smaller paper cutter, but again, it kind of became shifted a little bit. But yeah, if you can kind of push it onto the edge, hold that straight edge down next to it, and that's going to help keep the paper steady. And then usually when you use these, I recommend that you kind of like pull the blade towards the other blade, not very hard, but enough so that it stays together. So always making sure that you keep applying pressure here. And there we go. And we'll do the same thing here. Now, maybe in this next one, I won't use the straight edge because at this scale, you can kind of get away with not using a straight edge. But when I'm cutting big sheets on my big cutter, you have to use that straight edge. Otherwise, the paper shifts and then it kind of ruins your cut. So there we go. So I'm going to put my pinch marks on here. I'm going to kind of put the paper closer to this end, hold it down. This doesn't have a guard. My big cutter does have a guard. I'll make a video at some point, me using the big one. But the small one is all we need for this. And yeah, wow, it's just so nice. You line up those pinch marks on the blade, and the blade cuts right through them. And I'm going to compare these with these two that I just cut, and looks pretty close. I mean, I can still see a very slight hairline of color, but it's so close. Like, I think it will certainly work for what I need it for. So I'll just go ahead and just do this last one just to finish it out. Get those nice sharp mountain pinch marks. Put this down mountain side up so it hugs the blade. Hold that paper steady up towards this end of the blade. Perfect. And when I made this Bachetta star, I cut all of the units with this paper cutter using this method, and it worked great. So there you have it. Now there are lots of other ways, well, a number of other ways, let's say, that you can cut paper. Please drop your methods and techniques in the comments below, and I will close this video out by showing you one other cutting device, and it's kind of a moot point because they don't make these anymore. But if you're lucky enough to have one of these, this is a really great way to cut paper. Unfortunately, as I said, they don't make these anymore. This is called a envelopener. They were made in Holland. We used to sell these at the Origami shop. And I remember when I took over the Origami shop store, the Origami shop US store, I had this huge barrel of these. And we sold them for super cheap, not knowing, of course, that eventually the gentleman in Holland who manufactured these passed away. And his family decided that they weren't going to continue the business. So suddenly they weren't making them anymore. And we ended up selling out of these. Now, there are other types of this style of paper cutter. And the way this works is, in fact, when I was cutting my paper for the Petit Bouquet models, I used my envelopener. Now for these, you actually make a full fold. And this kind of goes against what I was saying before about cutting along a crease because you get that slight curve on the edge. But these are really nice because they have this sort of guide and kind of fits right in there. And then look at that. Beautiful. I really hope that somebody starts making this particular design once again someday. Now, there are some people out there, there's somebody out there who's making 3D printed versions of these, and I think Nicola is selling them at the Origami shop right now. There are also other brands of this type of envelope opener. I can't speak to how effective they are. Some of them might be worth checking out. But I guess one drawback is that there's a little X-Acto blade inside here that does get dull over time. And that's why when we used to sell these at the conventions here in the US, like people would buy them by the handful. And because eventually they do wear out. So if you have one of these or you still have your own stash of these, good for you. I'm happy for you. And if not, well, one can only hope that we'll start to see these again someday. All right, that'll do it for this video. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello again. I just wanted to add as an addendum here that, yes, you can get versions of that paper cutter that I was just describing on origamishop.com. They come in lots of cool colors. And I believe these are 3D printed, and they cost about $6.50 or about €5.50. So just wanted to throw that in there, and I hear that they work really well. So definitely worth picking up a few if you ever get the chance. All right, see you next time.